Security tackled black pilot. On the runway, entire crew stood at attention behind him. The tarmac lights burned white against the dark morning sky at Ashford Regional Airport in Georgia. Rain had just stopped falling, and steam rose off the concrete in thin gray ribbons. Captain James Whitfield walked toward his aircraft with a flashlight in one hand and a maintenance clipboard in the other. He wore his full airline uniform, 4 gold stripes on each sleeve, his captain's wings pinned above his heart. He had done this walk around 1,000 times. Check the landing gear. Check the flaps. Check for anything the ground crew might have missed before 200 passengers boarded his plane. He never made it past the nose wheel. A security guard's flashlight beam hit him first. Then a shoulder slammed into his back. "Don't move!" James hit the wet pavement hard, his clipboard skidding away. His hands wrenched behind him before he could speak a single word. "I'm the captain," he said, his cheek pressed to the cold ground. "I'm the captain of this flight." "Sure you are," the guard said, tightening the zip tie around his wrists. "Nobody just walks onto a runway." Above them, through the terminal windows, passengers had started to notice. Phones came up. A woman gasped. Someone banged on the glass. And on the jet bridge stairs, First Officer Sarah Nguyen stood frozen, staring down at her captain, pinned beneath a man who had never once asked to see his ID. She reached for her radio. "Get the station manager," she said, her voice shaking. "Get him now. They just tackled our captain." Nobody on that tarmac yet knew who James Whitfield really was, or how far this single act of that guard would go. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. I read as many of them as I can, and it always means a lot to see where this story reaches. If you enjoy powerful justice stories with unforgettable twists like this one, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep bringing you more stories just like it. Now, let's get back to Captain James Whitfield and the runway that was about to change everything. James Whitfield was 46 years old, and he had wanted to fly since he was 7. Standing in his grandmother's backyard in Macon, Georgia, watching crop dusters cut low over the tree line. Nobody in his family had ever set foot in a cockpit. His father worked at a tire plant for 30 years. His mother cleaned offices downtown before the sun came up. They didn't have money for flight lessons, so James found another way in. He joined the Air Force at 18, and the Air Force taught him to fly. He flew cargo planes over deserts most people only saw on the news. He flew training missions in Oklahoma winters so cold his breath froze on his collar. He earned his wings the hard way, one exam and one flight hour at a time. And when his active duty years ended, he kept flying part-time with the Air National Guard while building a career at a commercial airline. 22 years later, he had over 11,000 flight hours. He had captained aircraft through thunderstorms, engine warnings, and one emergency landing in Denver that made the local news for exactly 1 day before everyone moved on. James rarely talked about any of it. He wasn't the kind of man who needed people to know what he'd survived. At home, he had a wife named Denise, a high school biology teacher, and a 15-year-old daughter named Maya, who wanted to be a marine biologist. James coached her middle school track team every spring, even during layover weeks, calling in from hotel rooms to help plan practice drills. His crews loved flying with him. He was calm in emergencies, patient with new first officers, and the kind of captain who remembered the names of the gate agents and thanked the cleaning crew by name every single flight. He kept a small notebook in his flight bag, a habit from his early Air Force days, where he jotted down a few words about each new first officer he flew with, not to judge them, but to remember what mattered to them, so he could ask the right questions the next time their paths crossed. Sarah Nguyen was in that notebook. So was a young co-pilot from 2 years earlier who had once confided in James that she almost quit flying after a rough training class and who now captained her own regional routes because James had spent 3 extra hours after a shift talking her through it. That morning, he had arrived at Ashford Regional 2 hours early. Same as always, because a maintenance report had flagged a possible hydraulic issue, and James Whitfield did not send 200 passengers into the sky on a plane. He hadn't checked himself. He had no idea that decision would end with his face against wet concrete. And he had no idea that the man now zip-tying his wrists had done this exact thing before, to someone else, 6 months earlier, in a report that had quietly disappeared. Marcus Doyle had worked airport security at Ashford Regional for 11 years, and in that time, he had built himself a small, comfortable kingdom. He'd started as a night shift guard checking employee badges at a side entrance, and over a decade, he had worked his way up to lead security officer for the ramp and tarmac areas. A job title that came with just enough authority to matter, and just little enough oversight to go unchecked. His co-workers described him in 2 very different ways depending on who was asked. To some of the younger guards, he was a mentor, gruff but fair, always willing to cover a shift or show someone the ropes. To others, particularly the small number of black employees who worked the ramp and baggage areas, he was someone to avoid whenever possible, a man whose politeness seemed to evaporate the moment he decided you didn't belong somewhere. He liked being the man who decided who belonged and who didn't. He liked the way his radio crackled with authority, the way junior guards deferred to him, the way he could hold up an entire boarding gate just by raising his hand. Doyle wasn't stupid. He knew the rules. He knew that any employee on a secured tarmac was required to display a badge, and he knew that pilots wore visible airline identification at all times. He simply didn't look. To Marcus Doyle, a black man walking alone near a parked aircraft before sunrise wasn't a captain doing his job. It was a threat that confirmed something he already believed, long before he ever saw a badge or heard an explanation. 6 months earlier, he had stopped a black baggage supervisor named Terrence Hall in almost the same spot, shouting at him to get on the ground before checking a single piece of identification. Terrence filed a complaint. The complaint reached Doyle's supervisor, Airport Operations Director Craig Halstead, and Halstead quietly closed the file without investigation, noting only verbal miscommunication, resolved. Doyle never faced a single consequence. If anything, the silence told him he'd done nothing wrong. He carried that same confidence onto the tarmac this morning, flashlight raised, certain that whoever this man was, he would apologize and explain himself the moment Doyle demanded it. Instead, the man on the ground had calmly repeated 4 words that Doyle chose to ignore. "I am the captain." Doyle radioed for backup, his voice tight with satisfaction rather than concern. "Security to base. I've got a possible tarmac intruder near gate C14. Suspect is uncooperative." Above him, more faces pressed against the terminal glass. A flight attendant named Rachel Ortiz had already pulled out her phone and started recording, her hands trembling. Doyle didn't notice. He was too busy enjoying being right. He had no idea that within the hour, 3 different federal officials would be walking through that terminal for a ceremony that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with the man now lying in a puddle beneath his knee. By the time backup arrived, a small crowd had gathered along the terminal windows, and First Officer Sarah Nguyen was already sprinting down the jet bridge stairs with her ID badge raised over her head. "Stop! That's Captain Whitfield. He's our flight crew." Doyle barely glanced at her. "Ma'am, step back. This is an active security situation." "He's the captain of Flight 227, Sarah said, her voice cracking with disbelief. "You need to let him up right now." A second guard, younger, maybe 25, crouched down and finally checked the badge clipped to James's uniform jacket. His face went pale. "Marcus," he said quietly. "This is his airline ID. It's real." "IDs get faked," Doyle snapped. though something in his voice had already started to shift. By now, gate agent Michael Reyes had run out onto the ramp, and behind him, 3 more flight attendants stood at the terminal door, phones raised, recording everything. "Cut him loose," Michael said. "Now, before this gets any worse for you." Doyle hesitated one more second, and in that second, everyone watching saw exactly what kind of man he was. Then he pulled James roughly to his feet, cutting the zip tie without a word of apology, his jaw tight with something between embarrassment and stubborn pride. James stood slowly, brushing wet gravel from his uniform, his wrists raw and red. He said nothing to Doyle. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any accusation could have been. He turned instead to Sarah. "Are the passengers all right?" "They're fine, Captain. They're worried about you." James nodded once, straightened his jacket, and picked his clipboard up off the wet tarmac. But as he turned back toward the aircraft, a black SUV rolled up to the far end of the ramp, and 2 men in dark suits stepped out, scanning the scene with quiet, practiced attention. Doyle noticed them immediately, and for the first time all morning, his confidence cracked. "Who is that?" he muttered. The younger guard beside him shrugged nervously. "No idea. Nobody radioed us about any VIP arrival." Doyle straightened his jacket instinctively, the way people do when they sense, without quite knowing why, that they are suddenly being watched by someone whose opinion actually matters. Nobody answered him. Nobody at Ashford Regional yet understood why federal vehicles were arriving on their tarmac before 7 in the morning, or that their arrival had everything to do with the man Doyle had just thrown to the ground. Word of the tarmac incident spread through the terminal faster than any announcement could have carried it. Passengers waiting to board Flight 227 whispered among themselves, phones angled toward the windows. Someone had already posted a shaky 10-second video online, and by the time James walked back into the gate area, 17,000 people had already watched a man in a pilot's uniform get tackled on the ground. Inside the terminal, a family waiting near gate C-12 had also caught part of the incident on video, and the father, a retired police sergeant named Walter Briggs, shook his head slowly as he watched the footage back. "That man never even got a chance to explain himself," Walter muttered to his wife. "Not one word before that guard put him on the ground." His wife nodded grimly. "You know, if this happened different, in a different uniform, they'd have apologized before he even hit the pavement." Neither of them knew yet that Walter's small comment, recorded almost by accident on a nearby phone, would later become part of a much larger conversation about the incident, one that reached far beyond the walls of Ashford Regional. Station manager Patricia Alvarez met him near the counter, her face tight with concern. "Captain Whitfield, I am so sorry. I just heard. Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," James said, though his wrists still ached where the zip tie had cut in. "Do you need medical attention? We can delay the flight." "I need to finish my walk around," James said quietly. "That's what I came out here to do." Patricia hesitated. "Security is saying it was a misunderstanding." James looked at her steadily. "It wasn't a misunderstanding. He saw a black man in a pilot's uniform and decided I didn't belong on my own aircraft." Patricia had no answer for that, because she knew, somewhere in the back of her mind, that he was right. Behind her, the gate agent's monitor chimed with an incoming message from corporate scheduling, and Patricia's eyes flicked toward it out of habit. She froze for a second longer than she meant to. "What is it?" James asked. "Nothing," she said quickly. "Just an unusual note about ground clearances this morning. I'll deal with it after your flight." James studied her a moment, sensing she was holding something back, but he let it go. He had a plane to check. Meanwhile, inside the security office, Marcus Doyle sat across from his supervisor, Craig Halstead, already rehearsing his version of events. "He came out of nowhere," Doyle said. "No high-vis vest, no visible badge from where I was standing. I responded exactly the way I'm trained to respond. Halstead studied him for a long moment. There's already video circulating, Marcus. Multiple angles. This isn't like the Hall situation. We can't just close this one quietly. For the first time, real worry flickered across Doyle's face. You said yourself that situation was resolved, Doyle said. I said it was closed, Halstead corrected. That's not the same thing. Doyle's radio crackled on the desk between them. A dispatcher's voice came through, flat and routine. Base to all units, be advised. VIP escort inbound to gate C14. ETA 15 minutes. Federal clearance confirmed. Doyle picked up the radio slowly. Federal clearance for what? Unknown, the dispatcher said. Just clear the ramp and keep the area secure. Halstead's face went tight. Gate C14, he repeated. That's the gate you just cleared. Neither man said anything else for a long moment, the radio crackling faintly between them, both suddenly aware that something much bigger than a routine tarmac stop had just been set into motion. Outside the office window, the black SUV from the tarmac had pulled up near the main terminal entrance, and two men in dark suits were now walking briskly toward the gate area, flanked by a third man in an Air Force dress uniform, silver oak leaves gleaming on his shoulders. Doyle watched them pass, unease creeping up his spine. Who are they? He asked again. Halstead didn't answer. He was too busy watching the same three men walk directly toward gate C14, the very gate where Captain James Whitfield now stood, still holding his maintenance clipboard, still waiting to finish the job Doyle had interrupted. The man in the Air Force dress uniform stopped directly in front of James, and to the shock of nearly everyone watching, he snapped to a crisp, formal salute. Lieutenant Colonel Whitfield, he said. Colonel Grant Michaels, Air National Guard Liaison Office. We flew in this morning for the ceremony. Gasps rippled through the gate area. Sarah Nguyen's mouth fell open. Even Patricia Alvarez took an unconscious step backward. James returned the salute out of pure habit, his expression unreadable. Colonel, I wasn't expecting you until this afternoon. Change of schedule, Michaels said. The secretary wanted an earlier flight out. We were told you'd be flying today, so we planned around it. I take it you weren't informed. No, James said quietly. I wasn't. Around them, murmurs spread through the crowd. Lieutenant Colonel? Ceremony? Nobody standing there. Least of all Marcus Doyle, who had just stepped out of the security office in time to overhear it. Understood exactly what was happening. But it was becoming clear that the man Doyle had thrown to the ground 20 minutes earlier held a rank most people in that terminal would spend their whole lives saluting. Colonel Michaels lowered his voice. Sir, we heard there was some kind of incident on the ramp this morning. Are you all right? James's jaw tightened. I'll manage, Colonel. Sir, with respect, if a security officer assaulted a decorated officer of the United States Air National Guard on a public runway, that's not something that just gets managed. The word decorated hung in the air like a struck bell. Doyle, standing frozen near the security office door, felt his stomach drop. Whatever ceremony these men had flown in for, it was clear now that it involved Captain James Whitfield directly, and that Doyle had no idea what he had truly stepped into that morning. The only question left was how much worse it was about to get. Within the hour, Flight 227 had been delayed for a full mechanical and security review, and the terminal buzzed with a strange, uneasy energy. Passengers who had recorded the tarmac incident were now recording this instead. A decorated Air Force officer standing beside their pilot, speaking in low, urgent tones, while airport management scrambled to figure out what was happening. Craig Halstead approached the group, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Colonel Michaels, on behalf of Ashford Regional, I want to personally apologize for any confusion this morning. I assure you, we take security protocol very seriously. Confusion, Michaels repeated flatly. Is that what we're calling it? Halstead's smile faltered. It was a security judgment call that put a lieutenant colonel with 11,000 flight hours face down on wet pavement, Michaels said. I've seen the video, Mr. Halstead. Everyone has. Halstead's eyes darted toward Doyle, who stood a few feet away, arms crossed, jaw clenched, saying nothing. For a brief, false moment, it looked like the airport might simply smooth this over with apologies and paperwork, the way these things so often disappeared. Then Sarah Nguyen stepped forward. There's something else you should know, she said, looking directly at Colonel Michaels. This isn't the first time. The terminal went quiet. 6 months ago, Sarah continued, a baggage supervisor named Terrence Hall was stopped by the same officer in almost the same spot, under almost the same circumstances. He filed a complaint. Nothing happened. Halstead's face drained of color. That complaint was reviewed and resolved. Resolved how? Michaels asked. Nobody answered him. A murmur rippled through the small crowd of onlookers still gathered near the gate, and somewhere in the back, a passenger recognized the name Terrence Hall from a community meeting months earlier, where Hall had quietly mentioned being mistreated at his job but never gave specifics. She raised her phone again, this time recording not the confrontation, but the silence that followed it. A silence that said more than any statement from airport management ever could. Halstead tried anyway. That matter was handled internally. There was no need to escalate it further. Handled how exactly? Michaels pressed. Did anyone interview Mr. Hall? Did anyone review the footage from that incident? I don't have those details in front of me right now, Halstead said stiffly. Then get them, Michaels said. Today. Halstead's eyes flicked toward Doyle, a silent, panicked look passing between them, and for the first time, Doyle understood that his supervisor might not be able to protect him this time. Not with federal officials standing in the room, not with cameras already circulating outside. And in that silence, Marcus Doyle finally understood that whatever protection he thought he had, whatever quiet cover his supervisor had once offered him, had just evaporated in front of federal witnesses. His false victory from that morning, the confident certainty that he'd simply done his job, was collapsing beneath him one sentence at a time. Somewhere behind the group, unnoticed by almost everyone, a young gate agent had already pulled up the airport's internal complaint database on her tablet, quietly searching Terrence Hall's name. What she found there would blow the entire cover-up wide open. While security review meetings churned on inside Ashford Regional's back offices, James stepped away for a few private minutes near an empty gate, Colonel Michaels beside him. You never told anyone about the rank, Michaels said. 11 years flying commercial, and half your own crew didn't know you served. James looked out at the runway, where his aircraft sat waiting, wet and gleaming under the morning sun. I didn't join the Guard for recognition, Colonel. I joined because when I was 18, nobody in my neighborhood believed a kid like me could ever sit in a cockpit. And now? Now I fly 200 people across the country every week, and most of them never think twice about who's up front. James paused. That's exactly how I wanted it. Just do the job. Let the work speak. Michaels nodded slowly. Today's ceremony was supposed to honor your service record, the missions overseas, the training program you built for new Guard pilots, the recognition that's long overdue. We didn't plan for it to happen like this. James was quiet for a moment, his mind drifting back. Not to any battlefield, but to his father, decades earlier, standing in a driveway in Macon, watching his son leave for basic training with tears he never let fall in front of anyone. My father used to say the world will try to convince you that you don't belong somewhere before you even open your mouth, James said quietly. He said the only answer is to keep showing up anyway. He thought back to his first solo flight in the Air Force, 17 years old inside, though he was already 22 by then, hands shaking on the controls, an instructor's voice steady in his headset. He remembered landing safely, climbing out of the cockpit and calling his mother Collect from a payphone outside the hangar just to hear her cry with pride on the other end of the line. He remembered, too, the years afterward. Instructors who doubted him before they knew him. Commanding officers who softened only after he'd proven himself twice as many times as anyone else in the room. He had learned early that respect, for him, was never given freely. It was extracted, one flawless flight at a time. You'd think after 20-some years it would stop mattering what people assume the second they see you, James said. It doesn't stop. You just get better at carrying it. And today? Today, James said, I got tackled for showing up to do my job on my own aircraft. That tells you everything you need to know about how far some things still have to go. Michaels placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. Then let's make sure today changes something. Nearby, unnoticed by either man, Rachel Ortiz, the flight attendant who had recorded the very first video, was quietly uploading a second clip. This one showed Colonel Michaels's salute, clear and unmistakable, time-stamped only minutes after the tackle. By mid-morning, it would be the most viewed local news clip in the state. James's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Maya, texting from school during her lunch break, having already seen a clip of her father online before he'd even had the chance to call her himself. "Dad, are you okay? Everyone at school is talking about it." He typed back a short reply, careful not to alarm her further. "I'm fine, sweetheart. I'll call you tonight and explain everything." He slipped the phone back into his pocket, steadying himself. Whatever was unfolding at Ashford Regional was no longer a private matter between him, Doyle, and an airport review board. It belonged to the whole world now, whether he wanted it to or not. By late morning, word had reached the local news desk of a small Georgia station, and a young reporter named Kayla Simmons was already parked outside the terminal, waiting for someone, anyone, willing to talk on camera. She didn't yet know that the story she was chasing had roots stretching back more than a year, buried inside a filing cabinet 3 floors above her. Ashford Regional's boardroom, meanwhile, had filled with people who very much did not want to be in the same room together. Craig Halstead sat at the head of the table, sweating through his collar. Marcus Doyle sat beside him, arms crossed defensively. Across from them sat Colonel Michaels, Captain Whitfield, an airline compliance officer named David Chen, and a young gate agent named Anna Reyes, holding a printed report. "I found something," Anna said, sliding the papers across the table. "It's the internal complaint log from 6 months ago. Terrence Hall's incident." David Chen scanned it, his expression darkening. "This says, resolved, verbal miscommunication. No witness statements, no security footage attached, no follow-up interview with Hall himself." "Because there wasn't one," Anna said. "I called Mr. Hall this morning. He told me nobody from this airport ever followed up with him at all." Halstead shifted in his seat. "That complaint was handled according to standard protocol." "Standard protocol," David repeated, "is a full incident report and a review board when an employee alleges excessive force. This has neither." Doyle finally spoke, his voice tight. "I responded appropriately based on the information I had at the time." "Both times, both incidents," Colonel Michaels said quietly, "involved black employees on this same tarmac, stopped without identification checks, restrained before any verification. That's not 2 isolated misunderstandings, Mr. Doyle. That's a pattern." Anna slid one more document across the table, a printout of internal security camera footage logs. "There's a third one," she said, "from 14 months ago, a contracted mechanic. No formal complaint was ever filed because he was let go the following week and never came back to work here again." The room went silent. James Whitfield, who had said very little throughout the meeting, finally spoke. "How many more are there?" he asked quietly. "That never even made it into a log at all." Nobody in that room had an answer, and in the silence that followed, it became clear that this was no longer just about one tackle on one runway. It was about how long Ashford Regional had allowed this pattern to continue in the dark. David Chen closed the folder in front of him and looked directly at Craig Halstead. "You're the operations director," he said. "Every one of these complaints crossed your desk at some point. Hall's complaint has your signature on the closing form." Halstead's composure finally cracked. "I didn't think it warranted a full investigation. It seemed like an overreaction." "An overreaction," Colonel Michaels repeated, his voice cold and level. "A man was thrown to the ground for walking to his own job." "Two men," Anna corrected quietly. "At least two that we know of." Halstead's hands trembled slightly against the table. "I was trying to protect the airport's reputation." "You were protecting Mr. Doyle," David said, "at the expense of every employee he ever stopped without cause." Doyle sat rigid, his earlier bravado completely gone. "I followed my training," he said again, weaker this time. "Your training," Michaels said, "does not include skipping badge verification because of a person's skin color. That is not policy. That is a choice you made, more than once, and your supervisor chose to hide it rather than correct it." The full weight of the morning settled over the room. What had begun as a single tarmac incident had unraveled into a pattern stretching back over a year. One arrogant guard, one complicit supervisor, and an airport willing to look away as long as no one outside its walls was watching. Except this time, someone had been watching. Several someones with phones recording every second. James finally stood, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "I've flown planes through storms that would terrify most people," he said. "I've trained pilots half my age to stay calm when engines fail mid-flight. But nothing I've ever survived up there prepared me for lying face down on my own runway, while a man refused to believe 4 simple words." He looked directly at Doyle. "I am the captain." The room was utterly silent. "You didn't just fail to check my badge, Mr. Doyle," James said. "You failed to see me as a person before you saw whatever assumption came first. That's the real thing that needs fixing here. And no apology today is going to undo that on its own." Doyle finally looked up, and for a brief moment, something almost like understanding crossed his face. Not quite remorse, but the first crack in a wall he'd built over 11 years of never being questioned. "I didn't think of it that way," he said quietly. "I just thought I was doing my job." "That's exactly the problem," James said. "You never had to think about it. That's the difference between us." Colonel Michaels closed the folder in front of him with a quiet, final motion. "This meeting is now a matter of formal record. Mr. Halstead, Mr. Doyle, you'll each receive written notice of the findings within the hour." By that afternoon, Ashford Regional's boardroom had become the center of a decision that would ripple far beyond one airport. Before the meeting resumed, Ana Reyes slipped a final page across the table to David Chen. It was a printout of an email, dated the previous spring, from Halstead to Doyle, marked with a subject line that read only, "Hall matter. Keep this off the books for now." David read it twice, his expression darkening further, then passed it silently to Colonel Michaels. "This changes things considerably," Michaels said quietly. "This isn't oversight anymore. This is a written instruction to conceal misconduct." Halstead's face went white as he realized what had just surfaced. David Chen, representing the airline, spoke first. "Given the documented pattern of misconduct and the failure to properly investigate prior complaints, this airline is formally requesting Mr. Doyle's termination, along with a full third-party review of Ashford Regional's security procedures." Halstead opened his mouth to object, but Colonel Michaels raised a hand. "Before anyone objects," Michaels said, You should know that the Department of Transportation's regional office has already been contacted this morning, along with the FAA's Civil Rights Division. This is no longer a matter the airport gets to quietly close on its own." Halstead sank back into his chair. David Chen wasn't finished. "There's also the matter of the mechanic from 14 months ago. We've since located him. He's willing to speak with investigators, and he's confirmed the circumstances Ms. Reyes described. Stopped without cause, restrained, and quietly dismissed the following week under an unrelated pretext. That's 3 documented incidents in under 2 years," Michaels said, "involving the same officer, under the same supervisor's watch." Halstead had no response left to give. The airport's general manager, summoned mid-meeting, arrived pale-faced and clearly briefed on the unfolding crisis. She read through Anna's documents in silence, then looked up. "Mr. Doyle is terminated, effective immediately," she said. "Mr. Halstead, given your role in suppressing 2 prior complaints, you're suspended pending a full independent investigation into how these incidents were handled." Doyle stood abruptly. "This is insane! I did my job." "Your job," the general manager said quietly, "was to keep this airport safe for everyone who works and travels here. Not just the people who look a certain way to you." Security escorted Doyle from the building less than 10 minutes later, past the same gate where he had once stood proud and untouchable. Nobody in the terminal looked away this time. Nobody pretended not to notice. Outside, cameras from 2 local news stations had already gathered, drawn by the videos now circulating online. A reporter caught Doyle briefly on his way to the parking lot. "Mr. Doyle, do you have any comment on the incident this morning?" He said nothing, climbing into his car and driving away from Ashford Regional for the last time. Inside, Halstead sat alone in the empty boardroom for several minutes after everyone else had gone, staring at the printed email that had ended his career. When he finally stood to leave, he found Terence Hall waiting for him in the hallway, reinstated that very afternoon, standing quietly in his old uniform. Neither man spoke. Halstead simply lowered his eyes and walked past him toward the exit, leaving behind 11 years of quiet authority he would never fully get back. Terence watched him go, then turned toward the gate area, where applause was already rising for a ceremony he'd been personally invited to attend. Inside, Colonel Michaels turned to James. "The ceremony was scheduled for 11 o'clock. Given everything that's happened, we could postpone." James shook his head slowly. "No, Colonel. Let's do it exactly as planned. Right here. Let everyone see it." A small stage had been hastily assembled near Gate C-14, the very gate where the morning had begun in chaos, with a modest podium and a folded American flag resting on a nearby table. Passengers who had been delayed all morning now filled the seats and lined the walls, phones raised, waiting. At 11 o'clock, in the very terminal where he had been tackled hours earlier, Captain James Whitfield stood at attention as Colonel Grant Michaels read his commendation aloud. Recognition for over 2 decades of distinguished service, for training the next generation of Air National Guard pilots, for calm leadership under pressure that had saved lives more than once. Michaels read through the specifics slowly, deliberately, making sure every word landed. The overseas cargo missions flown through hostile airspace, the emergency landing in Denver that had saved a plane full of passengers with a failing engine, the dozens of young pilots James had personally mentored through some of the hardest years of their training. "It is my honor," Michaels said finally, "on behalf of the United States Air National Guard, to formally recognize Lieutenant Colonel James Whitfield for a career defined by excellence, humility, and unwavering service to this country." As Michaels finished, the flight crew of Flight 227, Sarah Nguyen, Rachel Ortiz, and 3 other flight attendants, stepped forward in their uniforms and stood at full, silent attention behind their captain, a gesture of respect no one had asked them to make. Passengers who had watched the entire day unfold began to applaud, quietly at first, then louder, until the whole terminal rang with it. 3 weeks later, James sat in his kitchen in the early evening light, watching his daughter Maya practice reciting a school presentation about marine ecosystems at the table beside him. Denise set a plate down in front of him. "Terrence Hall called again today," she said. "He wanted to thank you personally. Said the airline reached out about reinstating him with back pay." James nodded. "He deserves more than that, but it's a start." Ashford Regional had since implemented a full identification verification retraining program for all security personnel, developed in consultation with an independent civil rights review board. Craig Halstead had resigned before the investigation concluded, and 2 additional complaints, both against Doyle, had surfaced once employees finally felt safe coming forward. Sarah Nguyen had been promoted to check airman status within the airline, largely on the strength of how she'd handled herself that morning on the tarmac. She still called James every few weeks, just to check in. Ana Reyes, the gate agent, whose quiet research had cracked the case wide open, had been offered a position in the airline's corporate compliance office, a job she accepted without hesitation. She told James once, months later, that she'd almost talked herself out of pulling up that old complaint log that morning, worried it wasn't her place to go digging. She was glad, in the end, that she hadn't listened to that voice. The mechanic who had been quietly pushed out 14 months earlier was eventually located, interviewed, and offered a formal settlement along with a public apology from the airport's new operations leadership. Small, quiet justice, arriving far later than it should have, but arriving all the same. Rachel Ortiz's video, the one that had captured Colonel Michaels's salute, had been viewed over 11 million times, and had somehow become, without either of them intending it, a small symbol of dignity restored in public view. James didn't think of himself as anyone's symbol. He still flew twice a week, still ran his walk-around checks personally, still remembered every gate agent's name. But he had started something new, too. A mentorship program at his airline for young Black and Latino pilots coming up through flight school, modeled after the training he once received in the Guard. The airline had also announced, quietly and without much fanfare, a new policy requiring every regional airport it contracted with to complete annual bias awareness training for ground security staff, with independent audits every 2 years. It wasn't a perfect fix. James knew that. But it was more than had existed the day before Doyle stopped him on that runway. Colonel Michaels had called twice since the ceremony, once to confirm the commendation would be formally entered into James's service record, and once simply to check in, man to man, the way old friends do after something hard. "You handled that whole day better than most people could have," Michaels had told him. "I didn't handle it," James had replied. "I just didn't fall apart in front of everyone." "There's a difference. You could have just let it go quietly," Denise said, sitting across from him. Taken the apology, moved on, James thought about that for a long moment. If I let it go quietly, Terrence Hall never gets his job back. That mechanic from over a year ago never gets acknowledged at all. Someone else steps onto that tarmac next month, and it happens all over again. Maya looked up from her note cards. "Dad, is it true the whole crew stood behind you like that? At attention?" James smiled, thinking back to that moment in the terminal. The applause, the quiet dignity of it, the weight finally lifting from his shoulders. "They didn't have to," he said. "Nobody told them to. They just did it, because it was right." Maya considered that for a moment, then wrote something down on her note card, crossing out a line she'd already prepared and replacing it with something new. She didn't tell her father what she'd changed. But that weekend, during her school presentation, she added a single closing line that had nothing to do with marine ecosystems at all. A small tribute to a morning she said she would never forget. And a father she said she'd never fully understood until she watched a whole terminal stand up for him. James never heard that line delivered live, but Denise recorded it. and played it for him that night in their kitchen. And for the first time since the whole ordeal began, 3 weeks of quiet tension finally eased out of his shoulders completely. So tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. What was your favorite moment in this story? Was it the salute on the tarmac, or the moment the whole crew stood behind their captain? Would you have spoken up the way Sarah did, right there in that terminal? If this story moved you, do me a favor. Hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that respect is never something you have to beg for. It's something the truth eventually reveals on its own. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.